Can you trust it? Can you actually trust that the Bible on your shelf matches what was originally written 2,000 years ago? In April of 2026, a research team at the University of Glasgow recovered 42 lost pages from a 6th century manuscript of Paul's letters called Codex H. 700 years ago, monks on Mount Athos took that manuscript apart, scraped it, re-inked it, and used the pages as scrap binding material for other books. The text was gone, except it wasn't. The team pulled the ghost text off the parchment using multispectral imaging. In my world, we have a name for that: data recovery. I've spent more than 20 years in cybersecurity verifying whether data can be trusted, whether it's authentic, whether it's intact, whether anyone tampered with it. Today I'm going to run the New Testament through the same 4 tests I would run on digital evidence, and I'm going to use the real numbers, including the ones some Christians get wrong. Let me start by making the skeptic's case, and I'm going to make it at full strength, because if I only show you the evidence that helps my side, you shouldn't trust me. Here's the accusation. The New Testament was written in the 1st century. We don't have the originals, not one. What we have are copies of copies of copies, handwritten by fallible scribes across more than 1,000 years before the printing press. And those copies disagree with each other. Scholars estimate roughly 500,000 textual variants in the Greek manuscripts alone, and that count doesn't even include most spelling differences. 500,000. There are more differences among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. That's the telephone game argument, and it's the single most common reason people give for dismissing the Bible. One person whispers a message, it passes down the line, and what comes out the other end is corrupted beyond recognition. Now here's what I want you to notice. Everything I just said is factually accurate. The originals are gone. The copies contain variants. The number really is in the hundreds of thousands. Skeptical scholars like Bart Ehrman built careers on those facts, and I'm not going to pretend they're wrong about the raw data. What I'm going to challenge is the model. The telephone game is a single chain. One line of transmission, no verification, no comparison, no record. And if that's what the New Testament's transmission looked like, the skeptics would win. So the question that actually matters is this: what does the transmission system really look like? And is there a discipline that already knows how to answer that kind of question? There is. It's mine. In digital forensics, before any piece of evidence reaches a courtroom, it has to survive chain of custody analysis. Who created it? Who touched it? Where it traveled? Whether it changed along the way. If the chain breaks, the evidence is inadmissible. Doesn't matter how compelling it is. To establish that chain, we run 4 tests. Test 1. Provenance. Where does the evidence come from? How much of it exists? And how close is it to the original event? Test 2. Redundancy. Is there one copy or many? One transmission path or several independent paths? In my field, a single copy is a single point of failure. Multiple independent copies let you cross-check. Test 3. Integrity verification. When copies disagree, can you detect the differences, classify them, and reconstruct the original? We do this every day with checksums, hashes, and diff analysis, comparing versions of a file line by line to find exactly what changed. Test 4. Tamper evidence. Could someone have altered the data without detection? A system where tampering leaves fingerprints is trustworthy. A system where it doesn't, isn't. 4 tests. Provenance, redundancy, integrity, tamper evidence. The New Testament takes all 4, starting now. Test 1. How much evidence do we have, and how early is it? Here's where I need to clean house on my own side first, because Christians have been circulating inflated numbers for decades, and skeptics rightly call it out. You may have heard there are 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts, or 25,000 manuscripts total in all languages. Here's the truth. The official catalog runs close to 6,000 entries, but that catalog contains duplicates, items that were destroyed in wars and fires, and fragments later identified as pieces of the same manuscript. Scholars who have actually pruned the list, like Jacob Peterson in the academic volume Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism, put the honest count at roughly 5,100 to 5,300 Greek manuscripts, and the 25,000 figure, retire it. The careful claim is several thousand more manuscripts in early translations, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and others. Why am I giving you the lower number? Because in forensics, an analyst who inflates evidence gets destroyed on cross-examination, and so does the case. The corrected number needs no inflation. Watch. Homer's Iliad, the best attested work of classical antiquity outside the Bible, for years apologists said 643 manuscripts, but that number was also outdated in the other direction. The updated count is over 1,800. Most classical authors are nowhere near that. Many major works of Greek and Roman history survive in a few dozen copies, sometimes fewer. And here's the part. Almost nobody says out loud. For many classical authors, the earliest surviving copies were made in the Middle Ages, 500 to over 1,000 years after the author lived. Textual scholars Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman, and notice that's the same Ehrman, wrote that compared to other ancient works, the New Testament critic is embarrassed by a wealth of material. Now the timeline. And again, honestly, we have 0 manuscripts from the 1st century. The famous P52 fragment of John's Gospel, the small piece you've seen in 100 videos with the caption AD 125, should really be dated to the 2nd century broadly. Paleographers can't be more precise than that, and responsible scholars now say so. Around 100 manuscripts survive from within the first 4 centuries, many of them fragments, but some of them substantial. Major papyrus codices of the Gospels, and Paul's letters from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and then complete New Testaments like Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus in the 4th century. So the honest picture is this: a gap of decades to a couple of centuries between composition and our substantial surviving copies. That might sound like a weakness until you put it next to everything else from the ancient world, where the standard gap is many centuries and the copy count is a rounding error. If the New Testament fails provenance, then every document from antiquity fails, and we know nothing about Rome, Greece, or anyone else. No historian accepts that. Test 1. Passed and passed with the corrected numbers. Test 2. Was this a single chain or a distributed system? Here's where the telephone game model dies. The telephone game is one line. Corrupt any link and everything downstream is corrupted, and you have no way to know. Engineers call that a single point of failure, and we design systems specifically to eliminate it. You know what eliminates it? Independent replication, multiple copies, multiple paths, multiple locations, so that an error in one line can be detected by comparison against the others. That is exactly what the New Testament's transmission looks like. Within a few generations, these documents were being copied independently in different regions: Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, North Africa, Rome. Not one line, many lines, geographically separated, developing in parallel. Then add the translations. By the early centuries, the text was rendered into Latin, Syriac, and Coptic, each translation becoming its own independent witness stream, frozen in another language. And there's a third stream that most people never consider: the Church Fathers. Early Christian writers quoted the New Testament constantly in sermons, letters, and commentaries, hundreds of thousands of citations across the early centuries. Think of that as an independent log source. Even if every manuscript vanished tonight, the quotations alone would preserve an enormous portion of the text, time-stamped and geolocated by authors whose dates and locations we know. In my world, when I want to know if a file was corrupted, I don't stare at one copy. I pull the backups from different servers in different data centers, and I compare. A corruption introduced in Egypt in the 3rd century shows up as a mismatch against the copies in Syria and the quotations in North Africa. The system is self-auditing by architecture. Single chain? No. This is a mesh network with 3 independent witness classes: Greek manuscripts, early translations, and patristic citations. Test 2. Passed. Test 3. And this is the one the whole debate turns on: those 500,000 variants. Time to open the diff report. First, understand why the number is big, because this is counterintuitive until you think like an engineer. Peter Gurry, the Cambridge-trained scholar who produced that estimate in 2016, made the point himself. The variant count is a function of how much copying happened, not how badly it happened. More manuscripts means more recorded differences, the same way more log entries mean more anomalies logged. If we had only 10 manuscripts, the variant count would be tiny, and our confidence would be far worse. A huge variant count on a huge evidence base is what a rich data set looks like. The alternative, a clean text with no variants, would actually be suspicious. It would suggest someone standardized the evidence after the fact. Now classify the diff, the way we'd classify changes between 2 versions of a file. The overwhelming majority of those variants are the equivalent of white space changes, spelling differences, a Greek letter added or dropped by convention, word order flipped, which in Greek usually changes nothing because the grammar is carried by word endings, not position, Christ Jesus versus Jesus Christ. Nonsense slips where a tired scribe's eye skipped a line or doubled one, and here's the thing about those. Scribal errors fall into known, predictable classes. Skipped lines, repeated lines, similar letters confused. In my field, we'd call those known failure modes, and known failure modes are reverse engineerable. Text critics detect them and correct for them the way error-correcting systems detect bit flips. After you filter all of that, what's left? Variants that are both meaningful, they change what the sentence says, and viable, they have a real chance of being original. That category is a small fraction of the total, on the order of 1%, and here's the sentence that matters most in this entire video, so I'll say it carefully. No central teaching of the Christian faith depends on any textually uncertain passage. The deity of Christ, the crucifixion, the resurrection, salvation by grace. Every one of them is attested across passages whose text is secure. Even Bart Ehrman, in the question and answer section of the paperback edition of his own book, Misquoting Jesus, conceded that essential Christian beliefs are not affected by the textual variants in the New Testament. That's the prosecution's own expert witness. Test 3. The diffs are detectable, classifiable, and overwhelmingly trivial, and the disputed remainder touches no load-bearing wall. Passed. Before Test 4, I owe you full disclosure, because a chain of custody report that hides known issues is worthless. There are a handful of famous passages where the manuscript evidence indicates the text was added later. The three biggest: the longer ending of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, the story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 7 and 8, and a Trinitarian phrase in 1 John chapter 5 that appears in late manuscripts. These are real, they're significant in size, and scholars across the spectrum agree on them. Now here's what the skeptics rarely tell you. None of this is hidden. Open almost any modern Bible, and you will find those passages bracketed, footnoted, and flagged right there on the page. The system documents its own known issues in the product itself. In cybersecurity, we have a name for that too: responsible disclosure. A public record of known vulnerabilities, like a CVE database, is not evidence that a system is untrustworthy. It's evidence of a mature process. The untrustworthy system is the one with no disclosure log, and the process self-corrects in real time. A few years ago, rumors spread of a first-century fragment of Mark's Gospel. It would have been the earliest New Testament manuscript ever found, and some Christian speakers repeated the claim publicly before publication. When the fragment was finally published, it dated to the 2nd or 3rd century, and the scholars involved, including the evangelical ones, publicly corrected the record and owned the mistake. And by the way, that fragment is still the earliest known copy of Mark, and its text matches the Mark you already have. The correction didn't hurt the case. It demonstrated the case. This field polices its own claims, in public, against the evidence. Test 4. Could anyone have altered the message without detection? Run the threat model with me. Suppose someone in the 4th century, a council and emperor, pick your conspiracy, wanted to change what the New Testament says. What would the attack actually require? They would need to locate and edit thousands of manuscripts already dispersed across 3 continents, in Greek and Latin and Syriac and Coptic. Then they'd need to edit every quotation of every altered verse in the writings of every church father, many of them already copied and circulating themselves, simultaneously, without leaving divergent readings behind as evidence. That attack is not difficult. It's impossible. Wide, early, independent replication is exactly how modern systems make records tamper-evident. Once data is distributed across enough independent nodes, retroactive alteration can't hide, because the unaltered copies convict the altered ones. Every conspiracy theory about the Bible being rewritten at Nicaea dies on this hill, because we possess manuscripts and quotations that predate Nicaea, and we can simply look. And we ran the ultimate live-fire test of this principle on the Old Testament side in 1947. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls, our oldest complete Hebrew Bible manuscripts came from around the year 1000. Then the caves at Qumran gave us the great Isaiah scroll, copied around the 2nd century before Christ. That created a controlled experiment. Compare a text at 2 points separated by roughly 1,000 years of hand copying, with no contact between the copy streams. If the telephone game model were true, a millennium should have mangled Isaiah beyond recognition. Here's the fact-checked result. And notice I'm not going to give you the exaggerated version. You'll sometimes hear the scroll is 95% word-for-word identical. Strict letter-by-letter studies actually score lower than that, because Hebrew spelling conventions drifted over those centuries. So here is what the scholarship actually shows. Across 1,000 years, the book of Isaiah was preserved in substance, in order, in content, and in theology. The differences are overwhelmingly spelling conventions and minor scribal slips. Isaiah 53, the suffering servant chapter, the one that matters most, reads the same. And 2 honest caveats, because you'll hear them from skeptics, and you should hear them from me first. That's one book, not the whole Old Testament, and a few other books at Qumran, like Jeremiah, circulated in more than one edition, which scholars openly document. The Masoretic scribes, by the way, counted the letters and words of every book they copied and checked the totals against their exemplar, a manual checksum, 1,000 years before I ran my first hash. Test 4. The architecture is tamper evident, and the 1,000-year field test came back clean. Passed. So here's my professional assessment, stated with the precision a report deserves. 4 tests. Provenance. An evidence base of over 5,000 Greek manuscripts plus thousands of versional witnesses, with a gap to the originals that embarrasses every other ancient document. Redundancy. 3 independent witness classes in a distributed mesh, not a chain. Integrity. 500,000 variants that resolve under analysis into a text whose disputed remainder carries no doctrine. Tamper evidence. An architecture where alteration cannot hide, verified by a 1,000-year field test. Chain of custody. Intact. The text of the New Testament you can read tonight is, to a degree of confidence exceeding any other document from the ancient world, the text the authors wrote. Now the scope statement, because a good analyst never claims more than the evidence shows. This analysis establishes integrity, not veracity. I've shown you that the message arrived uncorrupted. Whether the message is true, whether a man really rose from the dead, whether prophecies written centuries in advance really came to pass, that is a separate investigation with its own evidence. Integrity gets the document admitted into court. The content still has to make its case. That investigation is exactly where this channel is headed. In the Impossible Odds video, I take the fulfilled prophecies of the Messiah and run the actual probability math, the same way I'd quantify risk for a federal client. If today convinced you the document is authentic, that video examines whether it's telling the truth. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The data survived. The question is what you'll do with it. I'm Dr. Lionheart. I'll see you in the next one.